Welcome to The Prescription, the Tax Policy Center's bi-weekly webcast on fiscal policy. This is one of a series of conversations with state, local, and federal government officials, as well as leading economists and other experts. I'm your host, Howard Gleckman, a senior fellow at TPC and editor of our blog, TaxVox. My guest today is Atif Mian, the John H. Laporte Jr. class of 1967 professor of economics, public policy, and finance at Princeton University. He was co-founder of the Center for Economic Research in Pakistan and is director of the Julius Rabinowitz Center for Public Policy and Finance at the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs. He's co-author of the book House of Debt with Amir Sufi, and he's the author of a new paper called A Goldilocks Theory of Fiscal Deficits with Ludwig Straub at Harvard and Amir Sufi at the University of Chicago. Professor Mian has his PhD in economics from MIT. Before we begin, our usual bit of housekeeping. We encourage audience members to submit questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. The event's being recorded and will be posted online at TPC's website. We are using captioning, which you can adjust or turn off with the live transcript button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you'd like to join the conversation on social media, please use the hashtag #LiveAtUrban. And if you'd like to suggest a future guest for The Prescription, just email us at info@taxpolicycenter.org. Atif Mian, welcome to The Prescription.
Thanks, Howard. Good to be with you.
Good to be with you too. So your new paper, A Goldilocks Theory of Fiscal Deficits, is a fascinating look at several important questions that arise in contemporary fiscal policy. You and your co-authors answer a critical question, which is in what circumstances can a country avoid higher interest rates when it runs persistent and even growing deficits? So maybe we can start, if you could first explain for our audience the conventional wisdom about the relationship between deficits and interest rates.
Yeah, so typically there is this sense out there, especially in recent years, that as long as the interest rate R on government debt is less than the growth rate of the economy, because the idea is that taxes, the revenue will grow at the growth rate of the economy. So as long as your interest rate on that debt is less than that growth rate, your debt is sort of not just sustainable, but you can always borrow more because you have this free lunch, perhaps, that you can cover your additional expenses through additional borrowing. And as the interest rate is less than the growth rate of the economy, you can continue financing it without having to raise new taxes to pay for the additional expenditure that you're doing. So that in some sense is an idea out there. What we show in the paper is that while there is sort of good judgment behind that reasoning, it's not complete. And in particular, we show that the condition that really matters for whether there is a free lunch, that is to say, for whether government can increase expenditure without ever having to raise taxes to finance it, it's not as simple as R being less than G, but in fact, R has to be less than G minus this another extra term, which represents the elasticity or the trade-off that government faces of the additional rise in its interest rate when it issues new debt. So we need to take that trade-off or that elasticity into account as well when we are figuring out whether a government may have a free lunch in order to finance its expenditures.
So you find that this free lunch is possible only if spending remains below a certain threshold. Otherwise, interest rates will rise and negate the free lunch, as you say. So what is that threshold? Help people understand where that is.
So it turns out that that threshold conceptually is remarkably simple to kind of keep in mind. A rule of thumb, if you will. Technically, we call it, C if R is less than G minus phi, where again, R is the interest rate on government debt, G is the growth rate of the economy or the expected potential growth rate of the economy. And phi is that elasticity term that I was referring to. Now, let me just say, because everyone understands what interest rate and growth is, so let me just say a little bit more about that elasticity term. That elasticity term is also quite straightforward, actually. All it means is how much the cost of debt, that is the interest rate, rises if the government were to borrow, let's say, an additional 1 percentage points of GDP. So how many basis points will the interest rate rise by if the government borrows an additional 1 percentage point of GDP? And it turns out that that number has been of interest to economists for a while now, and different people have tried estimating this number. So we have actually a good number of studies that have tried to estimate this elasticity. And when you do that, it comes out to be somewhere in the range of 1.5 to 2 percentage points. And so, if you take the average, it's like, you can say maybe it's 1.7 percentage points or so. All right, so let me come back to the rule of thumb. Now it's really straightforward to understand. You can look at the interest rate R on, like, let's say 10-year treasuries. And let me just give example of 2019, just before the pandemic, and we can talk about where we are later on. Just before the pandemic, that interest rate was somewhere between 1.5 and 2 percentage points. So that's the interest rate. The growth rate of the economy was expected to be 3.5, maybe up to 4 percentage points. So you can see R is less than G. 2 is less than 3.5 or 4. But remember, we have to also subtract this elasticity term that I just mentioned. And so that would be subtracting a number like 1.7, maybe up to 2 from the growth rate, which is 3.5 to 4. So when you do that, you basically come to the conclusion that the US was operating just at the boundary of the free lunch region. In other words, it had kind of expanded, it had kind of used up its capacity to use the free lunch by running a primary deficit at the levels that it was running in 2019.
So you compare, interesting enough, you contrast the US with Japan, that you say in the paper actually was kind of well within the range of the free lunch. So tell us a little about Japan and why that was.
That's right. And so the reason the situation is different for US versus Japan basically has to do with the fact that Japan, unlike the US, for example, in 2019, let's just continue with that example. Unlike the US, Japan was very much in what we refer to as a zero lower bound situation. That is to say, Japan had put its nominal interest rates at 0, and still it was unable to meet its inflation target. So when an economy is in that position that you have lowered interest rates as far as you can, which is typically 0 in nominal terms, and you're still unable to meet your inflation target, that is a telltale sign of this broader problem in the economy, which we refer to as a zero lower bound problem in general. And what it's really reflective of is, it is reflective of weak aggregate demand. And so we flesh out in the model that when the economy is in that particular scenario, which the US was not in 2019, but Japan was, when you are in that scenario, then almost by construction, you are always in a free lunch region. That is to say, the economy can actually benefit from the government to spend more by running a higher level of deficit. So Japan has that telltale sign, which suggests that it has a free lunch. It can actually boost its growth, and hence it will not have to raise taxes if it increased its government deficit by increasing its spending without raising additional taxes.
So this is good news in fiscal policy, but not necessarily good news for an economy, because it suggests exactly. You're trying to solve a problem through using fiscal policy. So it doesn't mean that everything is good. Obviously, it's the symptom is the problem with the economy. So there's obviously trade-offs here, and I'm curious, to your mind, what are the potential costs of being wrong about a deficit policy being a free lunch versus the gains from it being correct? Which has a higher ceiling?
Right. So the basic cost, unless you're drastically off, that's a different. But if you remain within bounds of reason, so to speak, The cost essentially is that you will have to raise either additional revenue through higher taxes in the future, or you'll have to cut future expected expenditure. So the real cost is the cost of adjustment, which is partly an economic issue, but perhaps even more importantly, it becomes a political issue whenever you have to change tax rates, or you have to change the level of spending that you have kind of promised, whether it's on healthcare or otherwise. And so that would be sort of the main sort of cost, if you want to think of it. You want to weigh that against the potential benefits of what you are using the extra spending on. And so that's how I would frame it. And in terms of understanding the magnitude of the risk that you're referring to, the risk of being wrong, so to speak, we can actually get a sense of that, because you can look at historical data and you can look at the volatility. Remember, the main condition I'm telling you has, interest rate is the most volatile term in that relationship. Potential growth is kind of reasonably steady over long periods of time for the US. And so really the volatility is going to come from potential volatility in the interest rate that the market is willing to charge the US government. And again, we have a good sense of that. So you can use that historical volatility and put further bounds on, okay, I want to be extra cautious. So I want to actually remain some distance away from what I have referred to as the free lunch condition. So you could do a further analysis like that if you were worried about this particular trade-off.
So there's also kind of an interesting political asymmetry here that I think you just alluded to, but the political process makes it much more difficult to reduce deficits than to increase them. So what does that say about the advisability of trying to implement a free lunch in temporary deficits, which is actually something that the US did over the last couple of years?
Yeah, so first, one thing I want to just clarify, everything that I'm talking about is about, and I think you mentioned that in the beginning as well, is with reference to long run sort of steady state analysis of debt and fiscal policy. So this rule of thumb is really useful to in terms of providing us with an anchor, long run anchor of what is sustainable or maybe prudent fiscal policy. And that's where these rules are most useful. That does not mean that if you get hit by a temporary shock like COVID, or if you get hit by a temporary shock like a recession, like we saw in 2008, none of what I said implies that you should not raise deficits in those situations. You absolutely need to, and you should, just like the US government did early in the pandemic. And so the way to think about it is that you can spend that to get out of temporary disturbances that the economy is facing. But once the economy stabilizes, once you start going back to normal, the way you want to think about long run projections, which, as you know, CBO does, for example, 10, 20 years looking out into the future, when you are evaluating those kind of projections, 5, 10 years out, and you want to ask yourself, should we go for this particular tax change, for example, or should we implement this additional promise of expenditures on behalf of the US government? When making those kind of policy choices, that is where this kind of framework is really designed to be helpful.
I want to ask you some more detail about the US, but before I do, I want to ask one other kind of international question, which is, how does an analysis like this apply to Europe? How does the fact that individual European countries don't control their monetary policy, but do control their fiscal policy, affect your thinking?
So the analysis really, or the framework, I should say, is quite broad in its applicability, and you can really apply it to any advanced economy. What you really need, kind of the key inputs that you need to apply this framework, is a measure from the market of the willingness of the market to hold the debt that you are going to issue. And so let me come to your European example, which is an interesting one. You can go country by country, and if the market believes that each country has its own different kind of risk profile, then they're obviously going to charge different interest rates to those countries. So, and we have seen that happen Germany typically will be charged much lower rates than, let's say, Spain or Italy. Now, obviously, that spread fluctuates from time to time. Again, partly given by markets' anticipation of whether they think Germany will implicitly bail out another European country inside the Eurozone or not. But regardless of what those issues might be, for us, the number that matters is markets' perception of an individual country's cost of capital, which again is the interest rate. And so remember the basic rule of thumb, right? Whether R is less than G minus phi. That's why it's so simple to keep in mind and use, that you can read the interest rate number always from the market's expectation. And then the only other thing you need, which is also country specific potentially, is this elasticity, which is how much does the market penalize a given country, let's say Spain? How much the market penalizes Spain if Spain were to raise its overall borrowing by, let's say, 1 or 2 percentage points of GDP. That's what this elasticity term phi really represents. And as long as you have those numbers with you, which we typically do, because these are modern economies, you know, we have a lot of data on them and people analyze and estimate these sort of the numbers that we need, you can plug those in, again, using the details of the framework and get an understanding of kind of the prescribed, if you will, level of primary deficit that is sustainable, and at what level of interest rate is, you know, does the free lunch still hold?
So taking what you said about the value of this in a steady state economy, I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about the current situation in the US and how this applies, how we should think about this. So obviously much has changed over the past 2 years, and much of the research you did was pre-pandemic. So not only was there a pandemic, but now the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So we've gone from a period of moderate demand, plenty of supply and low interest rates, to a period of high demand for goods, at least, severe constraints on supply and rising interest rates. And that gap between interest rates and growth rates appears to be narrowing. So where does that leave the US and its ability to increase deficits?
Yeah. Let me make 3 observations on that very important question. The first is just as an anchor and a starting point. Let me go back to 2019, the pre-COVID time period during the Trump administration. Now, that's an interesting time period because at that time, the US was kind of in a steady state because interest rates were around 1.5 to 2% for a few years. Government deficit was also stable. It was around, the primary deficit was around 2 percentage points of GDP. And if you apply the rule of thumb, whether R is less than G minus phi, as I've already mentioned before, the US would appear to be just about at the limit of the free lunch boundary. To say differently, if that steady state held, things look fine. Like, you know, you don't want to borrow excessively over the long run, but the market suggests the US is in a reasonably strong, decent fiscal position as of 2019. Now, obviously, a lot has happened, and that's basically your question about the current situation. So let me say a few things on, let me make my second observation on that first, which is, if you look at the incredible stimulus and hence expenditure that US government did, it obviously raised government debt to GDP by a significant amount, as we all know. However, that expenditure it so happened because of the supply constraints partly and other issues, perhaps stimulus was a bit excessive as well. We had this unexpected sort of rise in inflation as well. Now, as is well known, so this is kind of my second observation, that when there is an unexpected rise in inflation, it tends to actually help you write down the real value of debt. You obviously cannot keep doing that. That's why you want to be very careful. But you know, the fact that it happened once, that actually allowed the US to essentially write down as a share of GDP a significant fraction of its debt. And so that in a way absorbed some of the additional spending that the US. So I think that's important to keep in mind. Okay. Taking all of that as given, so that's my third observation to your question. How do things look going forward? Now, we are still very much in flux. As you know, COVID is still globally with us. China is in a state of lockdown, and you mentioned Ukraine and very serious supply chain issues elsewhere around the world. All of that is having an impact as we speak. However, we can still use the markets to peek a little forward into the future under the assumption that 5 years down the road, the US economy would stabilize and go back to sort of some reasonable level of expected inflation and so on, which is kind of what the markets are telling us as well. So if you look at, for example, the 5-year forward interest rate, or the 7-year, 10-year forward interest rate, which would be the interest rate that the market expects for the US economy 7 years out for the next 3 years. So that's what, from the 7th to 10th year, looking forward. If you were to look at those kind of interest rates, number one, and number two, look at CBO projections. So CBO projections right now, it basically, projects, again, 7 to 10 year out, primary deficit to maybe 2.2, 2.3 percentage points of GDP. If you combine those numbers together, and the interest rate of the 7 to 10 year interest rate, by the way, is now higher than what it used to be. So if you look at the market today, it is 2.8 percentage points or so. You again, expected growth rate, maybe inflation is also expected to be a bit higher. You will still remain within the sort of the margin of error of everything remaining sustainable. So I would say coming back, to the full picture, fiscal deficit looks sustainable 2019 before everything started, pandemic and all of that. And you look at the future outlook, I would say the US fiscal position remains reasonable. And given the current kind of expenditure policies and tax policies that are already put in place, when you take the market's expectations into account, my reading of the situation is that fiscally the US is in a reasonable position. It's not to say that the US has huge, incredible space that it can use whenever it wants to, but at the same time, I don't see the US as being in a difficult fiscal situation anytime soon.
So that's interesting because, of course, in his recent budget, President Biden sort of shifted his focus and now talking explicitly. In fact, he did today too, talking explicitly about deficit reduction. So, given this current economic situation, would you advise President Biden to aim for modest deficit reduction over the midterm? It sounds like you wouldn't. It sounds like you're saying that's probably not necessary right now.
No, let me separate. It's a very good question, but I'm not implying that at all, because those are two separate issues. The statement I made was my judgment on the long run sustainability of US debt and fiscal spending. And what I meant to say was that there aren't any warning signs in terms of sustainability of debt at current levels and given projected spending plans. That's why I mentioned longer run 2 to 2.3 percentage points of GDP primary deficit. All of those numbers and those projections look within the bounds of reason and hence look sustainable for the US. Now, the question you are asking is more of a shorter run question, which is not about sustainability per se. I will not phrase Biden's statement as saying we have to do that, otherwise the US debt will become unsustainable or anything like that. I think there may be other short-run issues, such as the inflationary pressures that the economy is facing, that might argue for a relative tightening of the fiscal position in order to reduce demand and hence put downward pressure on inflation. So I'm not necessarily making a statement one way or the other in terms of what should be done, but what I'm trying to say is that I think the framing of sort of Biden's remark, I would take it as a short-term question, which is more about fiscal side helping to bring inflation under control. I will not sort of use that necessarily to say, okay, this reflects that the US has a fiscal sustainability issue. I don't think the US has any significant sustainability issue.
Okay. Let me switch gears a little bit. Because in the paper, you also studied another phenomenon, which is one of special interest, I think, to those at the Tax Policy Center, which is what is the role of inequality and tax progressivity as government thinks about raising taxes to reduce deficits? So tell us a little bit about what you found there. I think it's very interesting.
Yeah. So there is actually a close connection between inequality and fiscal policy. And the reason for that, it's actually very intuitive once you kind of understand who holds US government debt. So in an earlier paper, we kind of went through the US distributional accounts, and you can see who, through financial institutions and money market funds and so on, who are the eventual households who own government debt. And what you find is that close to 70% of US debt held by US households is held by just the top 10% of the US wealth distribution. The point is that it is the very rich that tend to fund the US government to the first order. Now, what that means is that when inequality rises, there is actually, ironically, more fiscal space for the government to use, because now your client who typically holds your government debt now has more financial bandwidth to buy even more of your government debt. And so that creates kind of this link between rising inequality and fiscal space, which is, as inequality rises, the government has more fiscal space because it can, there are more people have more dollars on their balance sheet to hold government debt, your typical clientele. The other aspect of this is that because they are willing to hold more government debt, that also tends to reduce aggregate demand in the economy, because essentially the very rich are saving at a higher rate than the rest of the population. And so if inequality rises, A, you have more fiscal capacity, but B, you also need to use that fiscal capacity to keep economy at full employment equilibrium. And so that is the link between inequality. The last thing I'll say on that is, if you use, which often is the case and should be done, you use fiscal space to fight back against inequality. Once you are successful, you will also be reducing your fiscal space, and that's perfectly fine. So you can fight inequality, and once you are in a more equal economic environment, you actually don't need to run that high a level of fiscal deficit. And so that's sort of this additional insight that comes out of the framework that we develop.
So this is an interesting balancing act that you're suggesting. On one hand, it's important for government to think about inequality and to address it. But on the other hand, at least in certain fiscal situations, that may not be the right fiscal policy, although it may be a good social policy and maybe in the long run a good economic policy. So how do you tell a politician, how does a politician strike that balance, especially at a time like this?
I think the markets and the economic environment will basically tell you the way forward. And here's the reason. When inequality rises at the level and speed the US has experienced, the very rich getting more as a share of the economy, they don't spend as much. So that tends to contract aggregate demand. As a result, interest rates will start to fall and economy will start to slow down. And so that will necessitate the fiscal side to step in and spend more. It is not a coincidence that as inequality kept rising throughout the 2000s, governments across the world, they started spending more and more. And so we see this rise in government debt to GDP across the advanced economies, even outside of the Great Recession and so on. That's what I'm talking about, that it is that rise in inequality that actually A, creates fiscal space, but B, actually necessitates this requirement that government must spend more. Otherwise, you will be sort of led towards recessions in these advanced economies.
Interesting. Well, we are out of time. Atif Mian, this has been a fascinating conversation. I've enjoyed it a lot. Thank you for coming. Thank you for joining us. And thank you to our guests.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.